Good evening to everybody who is joining us. We will start in a minute. We are now live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We will begin in a minute. Okay. Good evening. I'm Sarit Zahavi, Alma CEO. Thank you for joining us here today. Our panel today will deal with the global activity of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm honored to have with us today Dr. Ariel Chorev of Tel Aviv University, Ido Zelikovic, who is the head of the Middle East Studies Department in Jezreel Valley College, and Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, which is the director of the program of extremism at George Washington University. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, Alma is an independent, non-partisan research and education center that focuses on Israel's security challenges on the northern borders. We see it as our personal mission, and actually it's my life mission, to provide research and analysis of the geopolitical reality and the developments regarding Israel's security challenges on its northern borders. We are situated on Israel's northern border in the Galilee, only about 6 miles, 11 kilometers from the border with Lebanon. By the way, 34 miles from the border with Syria. And we encounter these security challenges in our day-to-day lives. To learn more on Lebanon, Syria, and their effect on Israel's security, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Iranian development and deployment of proxies in Syria as a second Hezbollah, check out our website, israel-alma.org. Of course, I also want to thank our co-sponsors today, CSA and the Jewish Impact. Recently, we had published a report about the empowerment of Hamas in Lebanon and the military deployment they have been working on in the past few years. We traced very exclusive information that we believe is reliable, according to which Hamas had plans and programs to force buildup in Lebanon. Today, we understand that these programs were actually executed, but we don't sure about the scale. Hamas today has a capability of manufacturing rockets, has weapon and rockets depots in Lebanon. It has hundreds of combatants that were recruited from the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, I must say 70 years refugee, 4th and 3rd generation, a headquarter, and 2 operational units that are responsible for the training of the combatants and the terrorists. Last summer, Hamas used its new capability in Lebanon against Israel and executed 5 shooting of rockets from Lebanon to Israel 5 times that caused a lot of firing, a burning of trees, and damage to the environment, but luckily no casualties. This forced buildup is of course happening with the assistance and encouragement of Iran, sometimes while Hezbollah is very unsatisfied with that, and of course while endangering the Lebanese themselves. Ultimately, Hamas' objective is to create an additional front against Israel, which will allow it flexibility and other attack options beside its stronghold in the Gaza Strip. To complete the subject, we will hold a webinar of Hamas global activities to examine its arena of action behind Gaza and Lebanon, politically, socially, and militarily. This is very important for me to say. We are now trying to open the Zoom a little bit, not only the Zoom as a program, but the Zoom as a point of view, and to try to look further outside of Gaza, outside of Lebanon, trying to understand what is Hamas, what is the Muslim Brotherhood, what's their connections, and what's their connection between other countries in the Middle East, and of course also what's their activity in the West. We have only 1 hour, but I guess we'll do that. So I want to address my first question to you, Dr. Ido Zelikovic, which is, as I've said, is the head of the Middle East studies in Israel Valley College, a research fellow at the Esri Center for Iran and the Persian Gulf Studies in University of Haifa. a teaching fellow in Rachman University as well. Ido is the author of The Fatah Movement, Islam, Nationalism, and Armed Struggle Politics, which was published in Hebrew. Unfortunately, in Hebrew, I hope it will be translated soon, Ido. And Students and Resistance in Palestine, Books, Guns, and Politics, and this was published in English. So Ido, my first question is to you. Can you give us a really brief overview on the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood? What do they want, and how are they different from Al-Qaeda, ISIS, I don't know, other movements, jihadic movements in the region?
Now I'm unmute. Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you, Sarit, for the kind introduction. I just pronounced my second name, my family name is Zelkovic. Everyone call me Zelikovic, it's okay, but I pronounce it as Zelkovic. And to the question itself, I think one can describe the Muslim Brotherhood as a pan-Islamic transnational organization. And if I want to make my answer as short as I can, in this webinar, as I would say that in the end of the road, the Muslim Brotherhood wants or have a desire to establish a caliphate. But the main differentiation between the caliphate version or the political version with the caliphate as a political idea that belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood in comparing to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, I would say that in the end of the day, the Muslim Brotherhood are very pragmatic. And what does it mean? They are very pragmatic in the sense that they know the balance of power between them and the nation state. And therefore, they are working accordingly to the network of power in every domestic political arena that they are taking place with. For example, all of the Muslim Brotherhood Association and political branches learn from the history and the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt when the movement was founded. You can find that in Jordan, when they had a sort of collaboration with more traditional regime, they were very collaborative. You can find that in Egypt, when they've been hunted by unfriendly regime, say for less, yes, during the period of Jamal Abdel Nasser, they developed more jihadi version. You can find the version of Hamas, which is somewhere from the between of the two, because on the one hand, Hamas leadership in the West Bank grew up, educated and learned from the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, while the Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip was shaped and formulated under the military regime of the Egyptian until 1967. The big differentiation between Hamas and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, for example, if I make it very shortly, I would say that ISIS want caliphate right here and right now. They less care about the issue of da'wah, and they are more jihadist by nature. They also, not like the Muslim Brotherhood, don't have any problems to use the takfir, which means that to do takfir, it means that they can say or can act to Muslim communities as infidels. They are doing all whatever they can in order to apply their own political regime in their own version. They use force on Muslims. And the Muslim Brotherhood, in this sense, are by far more pragmatic. They don't want to Islamize society by force. They want to do it by a dialogue. They want to have a strong belief that society is ready for caliphate before they try to create it. Therefore, they recognize the nation state as a political idea. Although they don't like it, they don't pray for it, but they decided to use it for their own political purposes. So I will say that what is, I will summarize and say that the big differentiation is on the cosmological level. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are jihadists that want caliphate right here and right now. By the way, this is also changed by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda also wanted to, in the past, they didn't want to apply to caliphate in the current moment. And Hamas and other Islamist movement that goes hand in hand with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood have their sabr, have their patience, want to work first on moral issues, want to focus more on social aspects in society, to develop their dawah networks, and just then, later on, after they will take over the nation state, to work on building the caliphate from the caliphate as a political idea.
Okay, thank you for clarifying for us, Ido, this distinction. This is very important. I want to move forward to Dr. Ariel Chorev, which is the head of the Doron Halperin Middle East Network Analysis Desk at the Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University. Chorev is an historian focusing on informal networks in the Middle East and their analysis with tools combining empirical historical study and network theory. He is the author of Networks of Power in Palestine Family, Society, and Politics since the 19th century. Sounds very interesting. Dr. Chorev has a secondary interest in the geopolitics and of contemporary Middle East and the impact of new media on the region, as well as in the history of Lebanon. So, Dr. Chorev, how is Hamas ideology related to the Muslim Brotherhood? What's the connection? How are they different from them? And how are they separated from them? Ido mentioned that there is a gap generation issue, but I guess there is much more to it.
Of course, first of all, I would like to add on the very correct things that Ido said. I always use that metaphor to distinguish between, let's say, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and MB-based organizations such as Hamas, or Hamas including.
What's MB?
Is the metaphor MB, Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
All right, and I will use this abbreviations every now and then, probably because I'm too used to it, sorry. MB stands for Muslim Brotherhood. And I always use the metaphor of, while Al-Qaeda and ISIS want to erase a building, which may be the state, for example, and erect a totally new one, Hamas and Muslim Brotherhoods generally wants to take over from the inside and gradually build it again, but from the inside without ruining the facades. Okay, I think that's a good metaphor to describe the way they think, the process, and the differences. And this is why we often get. Let me give you an example. After Hamas took over violently, brutally on the West Bank, on the Gaza Strip in 2007, it was harshly condemned by Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, after, of course, Osama bin Laden, who said they are not interested in jihad. They are not interested in all those great values that they preach for. They are striving for power as any other corrupted Arab regime. This was Ayman Zawahiri's thing, and I think it's really embodies the differences between the two. Now, having said that, I think Hamas. Well, let's start with the Muslim Brotherhood. We need to understand Muslim Brotherhood, which is indeed a global movement. But what kind of movement is it? All right. I would portray it as a web of networks. Okay, I think that's the most accurate way to put it. A web of networks, namely local networks that may exist in each country with its own interest, promoting in its own things, working according to its own constraints, but still connected at the end of the day to the same kind of ideology, which ranges between just working for the well-being of Muslims to all the way to jihad. Okay, if you take it all the way, an Islamic caliphate, and exactly as Ido put it. So in the case of, Having said that, the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine, namely Hamas, are not the same as the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And I would say that in the case of Hamas, we see that the communalities in of course the jihadi way. There is no fighting or promoting the Palestinian cause without a jihad, without let's say striving for an Islamic state. And people need to understand, particularly when they're coming from the West, because we are all Westerners, and sometimes, we think according to our own patterns. We cannot understand that for movements such as Hamas, if you take from them those values of striving to Islamic State, of jihad, all those things, they are losing their raison d'etre, their justification of existence. There would become another secular movement that and therefore not special in any way. You can vote for Fatah or the PFLP or any other secular movement of that sort. So to put it really in a very condensed manner, I would say striving for an Islamic State, although with willingness, which we never know how much to what extent, okay, to make compromises on the way, not for the final goal. It doesn't mean that the final goal would be, let's say, two-state solution, okay, but to make compromises on the way until conditions will allow, reaching the final goal of Islamic State on Islamic lands, which include all Palestine and not just, the occupied territories or whatever, and including using jihadi methods.
Okay, interesting. So you're saying that Hamas strives to establish an Islamic State in Palestine, if I can just conclude.
Yes, you would see many, let's say, spokespersons for Hamas saying that they will promote equality and between the different sects and between men and women and LGBT and all that stuff. But you will never ever hear it from the official ones. You will just hear it, on social media and stuff like that. And I think there are more than occasional evidences that when you're going to the leadership, whether religious leadership or political leadership, you will get at the end of the day the same piety, I would say, regarding a Hamas cause, which is, at the end of the day, an Islamic State, not necessarily Al-Qaeda kind of a state, but a religious state, definitely. A religious state with religious values, Islamic values, definitely.
Okay, interesting. I want to move forward to Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, who is the director of the program of extremism at the George Washington University, an expert on Islamism in Europe and North America. His research over the past 20 years has focused on the mobilization dynamics of jihadist networks in the West, governmental counter-radicalism policies, and the activities of Muslim Brotherhood-inspired organizations in the West. Dr. Vidino's most prominent works are on the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, and he is the author of several books on the topic. And I'll just give you two examples. His first is The New Muslim Brotherhood in the West, which was published in 2010. And his most recent book is The Closed Circle, Joining and Living the Muslim Brotherhood in the West in 2020. Lorenzo, I would love to hear your take about that because I'm a little bit confused. I learned that there is nationalism and national identities and national values are going hand in hand with secularism. And now I hear that there is a religious movement named Hamas that want to establish an Islamic State in Palestine. Are they nationalists, or are they religious, or are they both? And what's the connection between them and the Muslim Brotherhood when we speak about the Palestinian issue, which is an issue of a question of, again, of nationalism?
Those are very good questions. Before I get to them, let me first thank you for the invitation. And I really want to spend just a couple of words saying how a lot of people follow the work that you and Alma put out also outside of Israel. And I have to say, I commend it as a very high quality and very, very informative. So very happy to be on this webinar. With two colleagues who have pretty much said everything, and in ways that I could not find a single word to disagree with, because I think they were both spot on in every part of their analysis in trying to describe a very complex dynamic. So let me just try to slightly build upon what they say and sort of reframe it in a different way. But again, what they said is entirely correct. And let me take it from an historical point of view that might help further clarify the complex dynamic. The Brotherhood starts in 1928 in Egypt, and it soon spreads throughout the Arab world. And I think by the 1970s, 1980s, you'll find Muslim Brotherhood presence in every Muslim majority country and in plenty of non-Muslim majority countries, which is what I study, so the West, for example. The way it works is that this is a sort of a transnational family in which there is a branch in every country. Each branch is very much independent. Now, there's sort of a general model, there's an ideology that is common, and there's a structure that is common. Really, the big invention of Hassan al-Banna was not so much the ideology, I would say, but was the organizational structure of the Brotherhood, the hierarchical system, the very bureaucratic way in which the Brotherhood operates. That was really what al-Banna brought. It was very modern for his time, and that is very similar, if not identical, for all these branches throughout the Arab world, throughout the Middle East. Now, these branches are very much independent, and because pragmatism, flexibility, as my colleagues said before, are really the main features of the Brotherhood, they adapt their immediate goals, their short and midterm goals, and their tactics to the environment in which they operate. Now, when it comes to violence, for example, we were talking earlier about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, different Brotherhood groups will use more or less violence, in some cases, a lot of violence, in some cases, no violence whatsoever, in many cases, something in between, depending on a very cold cost-benefit analysis and assessment of what tactic, of what balance between violence and non-violence better furthers the Brotherhood goals in that specific setting, in that specific moment. So comes the Arab Spring, for example, the Brotherhood in Libya understands that in the environment of post-Gaddafi Libya, violence is necessary. If you're not in one way involved in the civil violence, in civil unrest there, you're not part of the future of Libya. So the Brotherhood gets with militias and embraces violence completely. You just cross the border into Tunisia, and the Brotherhood in Tunisia, which is the Al-Nahda movement, doesn't do anything like that. There's a democratic process, and Al-Nahda become part of the democratic process without using violence. That is not because there is a massive ideological difference between the two movements. It's just they assess that there's a different environment, and in one case, violence is useful, whether that assessment is correct or not, it depends, and in the other is not. Now, so Hamas is the Palestinian member of the transnational Brotherhood family. And of course, the circumstances in which it operates are very particular ones, because it is part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so it, of course, interprets, and I really like the analogy that was made earlier of the house and how Brotherhood groups, unlike Al-Qaeda and ISIS, want to demolish the house, want to sort of come from the inside, refurbish it. They're like interior designers, but at the end they really change it to their liking. And in a way, this is what Hamas does, comes into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, uses it to further its final goal, which is that of an Islamic state in Palestine. And of course, in case there was any doubt, to them, Palestine does not mean Gaza, does not mean the West Bank, means the entire area that goes from Gaza all the way to the current northern borders of Israel. So in a way, of course, the Brotherhood understands in Gaza, as in other parts of the Middle East, that it needs to operate in the current political structures, which are the structure of the state. But the final goal is, of course, that of the destruction of what they consider to be artificial borders between one country and the other. But they do understand that sort of this pan-Islamic reality, this caliphate, it's something that even in the most optimistic of terms is something that can be achieved 100 years, 200 years from now. So for the time being, they think in those national terms. So this is the sort of the hybrid nature that might be a bit confusing, but it stems from their pragmatism, from the understanding that the lofty dreams of ISIS and Al-Qaeda are unrealistic. The big tension, I'm going to close it with that, between the jihadists and the Brotherhood is the criticism that one has of the others. The brothers see ISIS and Al-Qaeda as naive dreamers, well-meaning people, don't get me wrong, they have the right ideology, but they're thinking in terms that are not realistic, their goal are not realistic. They're not going to be able to bring about the desired goal of creating Islamic states and then one Islamic state through violence, through bombings, through terrorism. The criticism that comes from the jihadists to the brothers is that they compromise too much. They abandon the true principles of Islam. They choose ballots over bullets, meaning they participate in the democratic process, which from their interpretation of Islam is not allowed. And so basically they make deal with the devils. They're not pure and they're abandoned the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path that is the only one of jihad. So this is where Hamas stands as sort of probably because of the very nature of where it operates as a group within the Brotherhood family that operates with a lot of violence, but also with a lot of politics.
Lorenzo, I must ask you, because when we spoke before this panel, you mentioned that the Palestinian issue is the issue that attracts, that mobilizes people to support this organization, also to support Muslim Brotherhood, and brings a lot of donors. Can you explain a little bit of that?
Yeah, of course. In a way, in a very cynical way, all the different Brotherhood branches throughout the Arab world use the Palestinian issue. They know the emotions that exist throughout the Arab world, and that has been for decades, and that is something that was created not just by Islamists, but also by the secular regimes of the region, in making the Palestinian issue such a central topic for Arab masses. So in a way, this is what they always refer to try to get people to their cause. When does the Brotherhood really become a powerful force in the region? It's after the disaster, from the Arab point of view, of 1967. The Brotherhood, which before then was sort of a weak force, makes the argument that we lost because we were in the hands of secular, corrupt regimes, like Nasser and the other regimes of the region. We will conquer Jerusalem, we will liberate Palestine only when we will fight under the flags of Islam. And this is something that resonates with a lot of people. And you see today, I look at the Brotherhood mostly in a Western setting. Whenever they organize events, Brotherhood networks in Western countries organize events, for example, against Al-Sisi to celebrate the Rabaa massacre. They get 100 people, they get maybe 200 or 300 people in the streets, most of them really hardcore supporters of the Brotherhood and their families. When there is something related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when there's a conflict with Gaza, it's hundreds of thousands of people easily mobilized. People within Arab and Muslim communities are easily mobilized. So very cynically, when the Brotherhood wants to attract people to its cause, they will use the Palestinian issue. And And in a way, Hamas is sort of publicly the crown jewel of the transnational Brotherhood family.
Very interesting, Lorenzo. I want to move forward, Ido, since Lorenzo just, mentioned that, and I want to understand how Hamas is building its image worldwide. How does it, since it is a terrorist organization that, sends suicide bombers to restaurants and buses, how does it trying to create a new image, a new even maybe political image versus the Palestinian Authority when we speak about its image worldwide? Unmute yourself, please. And one last note before you continue, Ido, I want to tell to everybody, you are invited to write your questions, please, because the chat is a little bit loaded. Please write your questions only in the Q&A, so I will be able to moderate them later on. Ido, please, your answer.
Okay, I was muted. Thank you, Sarit. First, I just want everyone to remember that I don't understand why, but Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization, not by all of the Western world, not by all of the free world, only the United States, the EU, Canada, already designated Hamas, including its political wing, as a terrorist organization. There are some other countries, such as Australia, for example, and New Zealand, that only designated the Hamas military wing as a terrorist organization. And even that more interesting to know is that there are some members of the NATO alliance, such as Turkey, that don't even consider Hamas as a terrorist organization, but also giving them an official place on their own soil. There is officially political board for Hamas in Turkey, and Turkey is also hosting some central military activists of Hamas on its soil. I would say that Hamas is trying maybe to change its nature and to change its image mainly since 2005, when we saw a generational change in the movement. After Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was assassinated by the Israeli army and was replaced by, later on, first it was replaced by Abdulaziz Rantisi, that served in his position only for 30 days and also found his death not in a natural way. He was targeted by the Israeli army. And since then, from 2005-6, actually the main leadership of Hamas moved from the Gaza Strip to the outside, first to Syria, then to Qatar. And there was also, like I said, generational change in Hamas leadership. Khaled Mashal, a very young, back then, charismatic politician, took the leadership from the hands of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was a theological leader, not just a political leader, but he was also a theological and a spiritual leader. And he realized that if Hamas wants, in the end of the world, to become the leader of the Palestinians and become more legitimate in the eyes of the Western world, it must change its face. That was the moment when Hamas decided to be more integrated, firstly, in the Palestinian political arena. And after they integrated into the political Palestinian arena, Khaled Mashal started to develop international networks of political and diplomatic ties, not just in the Arab world, but also with Western powers, political powers. And I would call the boy in his name, mainly with the socialist and Marxist parties in the West. In order to communicate with those networks, Hamas started to adopt a new discourse that first deals more with social issues. I will say paradoxically, mainly with the issue of human rights. They marginalized their own Islamic character in order to develop a bridge with this leftist Marxist powers, and that was the moment when they started to create what we like to call in the research community the Red-Green Alliance, the alliance between the red powers, the most Marxist and socialist parties, and the Islamist factors. Today, this alliance is part of the BDS movement. You can find them demonstrating together occasionally, and we saw that Hamas even went one step further, and in May 2017, Hamas published a new political document. By the way, this is the way that they call this document, and this is very important thing for us to understand, because it's new document, the political document. This is not the Dustur, which means the Dustur means the character, the charter. Sorry. The charter constitution. So if you have constitution, the constitution basically reflects what you believe in. If you will read the original constitution of Hamas from 1988, you will find that it's full with Quranic and Hadithic quotes that actually saying in a very clear way what Hamas stands all about. From the political document of 2017, you can find another voices. In 2017, Hamas started to create a new discourse that portrayed it as more nationalist movement that working for the liberation of Palestine from the hands of their oppressors, in brackets, and they put all of the Islamist and they put the Islamist spirit aside. In the new document, you barely can find quotation from the Quran, and if you will find it, you will find half sentences that were integrated to the text in a very political context. So I would say in this way, Hamas also wanted to create a new discourse that will help it to compete with Fatah, with the PLO, over the hearts and the minds of the Palestinian communities in the diaspora, and also to start and to portray itself as the natural political replacer of Fatah. And if we will read this political document very carefully, we will understand that first and foremost, it was written to the ears of the Palestinians and the Arab community. Secondly, this is a bridge that they're trying to use it in order to create a new dialogue with the international community. And the main aim of this change is in order to take the PLO from the within, because the PLO has this statutory place as the legitimate sole representative of the Palestinian people. And Hamas today wants to first integrate into the PLO, therefore they entered into local politics in Palestine, and they know that this is the only way to receive legitimation, a political legitimation, first from the Arab world, in the Arab domain, and from there they want to continue and to develop a dialogue with the international community.
Okay, Ido, since you mentioned the Arab world, I must ask you now, Hamas and Saudi Arabia, what's going on? They were the natural supporters of Hamas, and suddenly this changed. Can you explain what happened there in brief?
Yes, Arit, and I will try to be as brief as I can. First, I want to say that this marriage, we should maybe call it like this, between Saudi Arabia and Hamas back then, in the beginning of the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, wasn't the marriage from heaven. Historically and traditionally, Saudi Arabia theologically stands for Wahhabi Islam, and Hamas are the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't go hand in hand. What was happened back then was strictly political maneuver of Saudi Arabia. They were very angry at Yasser Arafat because he supported Saddam Hussein back then in 1991 during the days of the First Gulf War. So in order to punish the PLO, they decided to cut funds to the PLO, and then the PLO went into a very seriously political crisis that led him in the end to a dialogue with the United States and Israel. And the Saudis decided as a counterweight to deliver more goods to the Hamas. They supported them economically, and today, as we see that Saudi Arabia, once again, especially after 9/11, wants to create more moderate image for itself. They also decided to detach themselves from Hamas, from other terrorist organization, and to be more connected to the West. And I think that this change will go on in the future, mainly via Mohammed ibn Salman, the successor, that sees these ties with the Western world as strategically ties that are very important to Saudi Arabia national security.
So what we are actually saying is that Wahhabism of Saudi Arabia and Gaza and Lebanon Muslim Brotherhood is not exactly the same ideology. It's not exactly
Definitely
the same
not.
interpretation.
Definitely. This is not marriage from heaven.
Okay, interesting.
Therefore, you see that from the Wahhabism later on. So another jihadi Salafi organization that grew up, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. If you want also to understand this rivalry between of the two, Al-Qaeda and Hamas, it comes from their theological roots. One are the successor of Hassan al-Banna, and the second are the following of Wahhabism.
Interesting. Harel, okay, so now I understand it's not all about ideology, especially when we speak about Egypt, even more so. But Egypt is the main moderator between Hamas and Israel. What's the relationship over there? Can you give us some insight about the relationship between Hamas and Egypt?
Well, Hamas, yes. Hamas, they are the neighbors.
Question for Harel.
Thank you. Sorry.
Harel, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, I would say this. It started, after Morsi came into power, it was a dream come true, I would say, that the Hamas could not hope for anything better than such a development. However, we all know what happened, and after a year, it was toppled down, and Sisi and his government came in, and that's all known. Now, Sisi saw Hamas as another offshoot of its most fierce enemies, which are Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, involved in all kinds of attacks against Egypt, all kinds of other activities that the Egyptian didn't like, including smuggling weapons back and forth from the West Bank. Sorry, again, I'm calling the Gaza Strip the West Bank, from the Gaza Strip to the Sinai Desert, assisting ISIS terrorists in the Sinai Desert, attacking Egyptian forces. So overnight, I would say, the Egyptian turned from being, I would say, a very a friendly government to Hamas to a very hostile one. The Egyptian army, even before the Morsi left, the army acted as almost an independent, I would say, power, and flew in the tunnels under the border between Rafah and the Sinai Desert with the sewer, causing Hamas a lot of damage. And for several years, the relationships were really bad. Over the world, usually when operations such as Protective Edge or Guardian of the Walls are taking place, Israel is being accused of besieging the Gaza Strip, but people usually don't take a lot of attention to the fact that Egypt is not less influential in that context, not allowing whether merchandise or other supplies to go in. And so Egypt has a lot of effect on the Gaza Strip. Now, in the past few years, I would say it happened gradually, but something shifted in the strategic concept of the Egyptian of Hamas, and although there, I would say, natural animosity, and it's there, no worries, it's still there vis-a-vis Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. They understood that they need to work pragmatically, both to get Hamas consent or cooperation in terms of ISIS, for example, not smuggling weapons and assisting ISIS in any way. This is from the Egyptian interest, and also from the point of view of keeping keeping the Gaza Strip pacified. And the Egyptian understood that they cannot actually secure this interest without cooperating with Hamas to some sort or to some extent. Now, it also puts the Egyptian in a very valuable, I would say, regional position as the great mediators, the people who cut the deals, who are promoting peace, looking good in an American eyes, looking valuable in American eyes, and therefore this made them change their strategy in a way that it is, to my view, is much more pragmatic and useful, even from an Israeli point of view. Because if you don't have a mediator working with Hamas, who are you going to use for that task? And Israel actually tackled that problem during Protective Edge in 2014. Part of the problem was that the Egyptian could not really be mediators that will bring the end of the war closer. Okay, they actually worked against Hamas. They worked as mediators, but we know they also did all kinds of things to incite against Hamas.
Okay,
now,
this is very interesting, Ariel, because now we understand that it's not only Egypt. We see Turkey more and more involved. We see Qatar more and more involved. And here I want to address the question to Lorenzo now, and to ask you, Lorenzo, okay, what's Qatar's got to do with that? What's Turkey's got to do with it? They are not even bordering Israel. Why are they involved in the relationship between Hamas and Israel, and money in the suitcases, and Erdogan speaks about it, and what's going on with these two countries? And I'm sorry, but we only have very few minutes because I want to have some time to answer questions.
Yeah, very briefly. This has to do with the geopolitics of the region, which have changed significantly over the last 10 years since the Arab Spring. I would say that until 15, 20 years ago, pretty much all Gulf countries supported Hamas. Saudis were, everybody else was. Now, the big change was with the Arab Spring. Saudis, the Emiratis, every country in the Gulf except Qatar started seeing the Brotherhood in extremely negative terms. I mean, the Brotherhood is designated as a terrorist organization in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And Hamas, being the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood, fell out of favor significantly in that region. Now, Qatar is the voice, is a dissenting voice in the GCC, in the Gulf. Qatar has ideological reasons to be aligned with Hamas, from Yusuf al-Qaradawi, sort of the spiritual leader of the global Brotherhood, who's based in Doha. So there's a strong ideological affinity, but there are more cynical geopolitical reasons, which basically have led the Qataris to see the Brotherhood globally as a way to extend their power throughout the region and beyond. And this is the reason why Qatar had such bad relations with all its neighbors. So it was Qatar against the Gulf, at least, not Qatar against the world. So Hamas became a large recipient of just Qatari funds. Of course, some of it there's an understanding, there's an awareness of that in both the US and Israel government that these dynamics do happen. And so it's a complicated game there. The second big player you mentioned is the only other country in the region that in close alliance with Qatar supports the Brotherhood, and that is Turkey. And that is, again, for both ideological and geopolitical reasons. Erdogan comes from an Islamist Brotherhood milieu. He comes from basically the equivalent of the Brotherhood in Turkey as a movement. So there is that ideological affinity, and at the same time, he has been supporting, for geopolitical reasons, Brotherhood organizations throughout the region, and therefore Hamas. Again, with that ambiguity in which Turkey has relations, as you know, there's an embassy in Tel Aviv, and has friendly relations, but at the same time, which have not really ended since Erdogan has gone to power, with strong commercial relations with Israel and so on, but at the same time, there's strong support for Hamas, which is not just political, but it's also very operational, with the strong accusations coming from Israel of Turkey being a base for military operations against Israel. So you have these two countries, which are really the two countries that support the global Muslim Brotherhood. It only makes sense if they also support Hamas.
Lorenzo, there is a question here. Since you talked about Turkey, what would be Turkey's view or position with regard to an escalation on Israel-Lebanese border while Hamas is involved? Now that we published this report about Hamas, you know.
Well, that's a very big hypothetical question. Where would Turkey stand? Turkey plays, as I said, a bit of an interesting game, because of course, you know, there's rhetoric, and Erdogan will, of course, say always spend himself in support of Hamas and against Israel, and so on and so forth. Remember the flotilla incident, and so on and so forth. Having said that, as I was saying earlier, there's a sort of pragmatism. Even over the last few months, you've seen that Turkey has actually somewhat toned it down one or two notches in terms of its rhetoric. There's now a dialogue with Egypt. And partially that has to do with the terrible financial circumstances in Turkey, and this role that Turkey has played, in which it has isolated itself politically, largely because of its support of the Brotherhood. It's something that is not sustainable from, I mean, if you just have to look at the way the Turkish lira has been in free fall over the last few months. And that, of course, dictates the policies and the views also somebody that is a deep ideologue, like the Turkish regime in general, and Erdogan in particular. So where exactly we'll stand, my sense is will probably be barking very loud, but at the end of the day, not doing necessarily much in terms of deeds.
Really? Okay. I must say that my guess is that Turkey will try to promote quick resolutions in the United Nations against Israel, and will support any effort to stop hostilities very quickly without enabling us to do anything realistic in Lebanon.
But I think I put that most in the category of barking, I think.
Okay, I wish you were right, but no, usually it succeeds in stopping our operations. But in any case, I want to move forward to the questions from the audience. And Lorenzo, I'm still with you because it's a question to you, and I think it's a very short answer, because the question is, are they, and I guess they is like this Muslim Brotherhood movement, are they trying to take over the Middle East or to take over the whole world?
It's a gradualist movement. As we said, it first wants to take over the individual countries in which it operates, then creating an Islamic super state. Now, of course, there is also pipe dreams about, there's statements of Muhammad Akif, former Murshid of the Brothers, says Islam as a message that resonates for all humanity. As a good Muslim, I only want to hope that everybody in the world will embrace Islam. So there is that global nature of the calling of Islam that not just the Brotherhood has, I would say a lot of conservative Muslims would have. At the same time, this is a pragmatic, gradualist movement. They understand that even taking over, and if you see how things are going for the Brotherhood right now in the Middle East, they're not doing great. Just taking over individual countries is something extremely, extremely difficult. So there's pipe dreams and then there's reality, and the Brotherhood is very anchored in reality.
Okay, Ido, here we have a question that I really tried to avoid because this is the hot potato, and I'm sure that you will find the right way to address it. And Ido, this is how the question goes. Is it your assessment that Ram party aligned to Muslim Brotherhood? And if so, what are implications of them being part of the coalition in the government with access to sensitive information? By the way, I'm not sure they have access to sensitive information, and I'm saying that as a former intelligence officer. But if you can address the first part of the question, what about Ram party? What can you say about that?
First, thank you, Sarit, for giving me this hot potato. I usually love to take this hot potato with a grain of salt. So this is what I will try to do right now. There is a connection, ideological connection between the Muslim Brotherhood to Ram party, the Islamic movement in Israel. Both of its factions are related to the global ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I will say that in this sense, the Ram party is by far more focused on issues of social, political, and moral issues. So when it's come to the political scale, I agree with Lorenzo. The Muslim Brotherhood, by and large, have a lot of colors and a lot of voices, but in the end of the day, they are very down to earth. They are pragmatic, they are rationalist. And the Ram party decided to play in Israel according to the political rules of the country. They are recognizing the nature of the state. They are obeying the law. Israel is a democratic country. It's a free country. So there is no problem that Ram will take part in our political establishment. Furthermore, I want also to address that also in the past we already had other political member of the Knesset from the Communist Party or from other Arab parties that were members in committees of the Knesset, such as security and foreign affairs. There is nothing new about it. Arab citizens in Israel, they are like any other citizens in Israel, and therefore the member of the parliament should have access for every committee of the Knesset. After saying all of those, I also want to add that in the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee of the Knesset, there is no real and a serious discussion of the most classified issues of Israel national security. Over there, you just can sit, have a nice cup of tea, hear some short briefs by members of the army or the foreign ministry, and all of the hard and secret and interesting discussions are heading in very close and intimate forum. So I will
Definitely.
so I will also want to add another sentence to my answer, and I hope I was very gentle with this hot potato, that as Israeli citizen, I'm very proud to be Israeli. I'm very proud that in our democratical system, we have places for all different voices that lives together in coexistence in our country. I'm very proud to be Israeli.
Ido, thank you very much for that. Ariel, there is another question, and this would be the last one. We have many questions. I have a lot of questions. So we will try to answer them in that way or another outside of this webinar. But last question to you, Ariel. How vulnerable is the Palestinian Authority to being taken over by Hamas in the West Bank? Is this an option? Is this a realistic option?
It is a realistic option, as we saw in 2007, although I think since 2007, and I have several friends working for the PA, including ministers, who I always ask, how did you let them take over in 2007? How did you let them build their Jesh Sha'bi, their popular army, under your nose, not doing anything? And I always get more or less the same answer as we learned our lesson. And they did learn their lesson, because I don't know how much our audience is aware of that very traumatic event of 2007, when Hamas, being a minority, I mean their forces being a minority against all the might of the Palestinian Authority security organizations in the Gaza Strip, Hamas succeeded to take over, brutally shooting people, throwing other Palestinians from the roofs. And this is it's a huge trauma for the PA people, huge trauma. So they vowed not to allow it again. This explains us, of course, why they are cooperating with Israel, among other things, inter alia. It is not because they are cooperators with Israel as they are often being accused. It's because they care about their own, and they're telling you this right on the, they put it on the table. We're doing it for ourselves because we don't want this country to fall to the hands of Hamas. Having said that, from the popular point of view, they have a huge problem. They have a segment that definitely support Hamas in the West Bank. I would say the majority, actually, if you compare between, let's say, Fatah PAs dominated by the Fatah movement, of course, the Fatah supporters are fewer than the one who supports Hamas. So it's a constant threat for them. But, there is a difference between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I think that if you'll ask most of the people in the Gaza Strip today if they support Hamas, I think most of the people will give you a negative answer because of their hardship, Their experience is very bad since 2007, and we have several indications for that. However, in the West Bank, it's a different story, and therefore it puts Hamas puts the PA in a very threatened position. I think everybody are waiting for the shifts of generation when Abu Mazen, the president, Mahmoud Abbas will step down and then, or just die. And then we will see a generational shift, which may change the relations, maybe to a more cooperative sort of model. We don't know. But I think the threat, the sense of threat and animosity from the PA vis-a-vis Hamas is there, and therefore they will try to avoid any kind of Hamas takeover the West Bank.
Wow, Ariel, thank you so much for that. Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, Dr. Ido Zelkovich, and Dr. Ariel Chorev, I feel grateful to have you with us today. It was a very interesting panel, and I think this is a very interesting and complicated issue, and we only touched the tip of the ice of all these issues that we discussed today. But after this discussion, it is very clear that terrorist organizations such as Hamas, such as Hezbollah, do not stay in the Middle East. They are influencing and they are endangering also other countries, and of course also elsewhere in the West, first and foremost because they operate against Western values before everything, before the Israeli-Palestinian issue. If you like what you do, if you like what we do in Alma, if you enjoy this webinar, we invite you to donate. In a minute, the link will be in the chat. Alma has various educational programs in various topics concerning Israel's north and the challenges here. Our full program is on our website, and we look forward to see you again on our programs. You can invite your friends and reserve a specific program. Everything is available physically and digitally if you cannot come to Israel. Things are now becoming better and improving with COVID. I hope that the next year, 2022 will be better, and we will be able to see you face to face as we used to. But as long as this is the case, we can do that. We can do that digitally very easily. So I'm Sarit Zehavi, live from the Galilee, northern Israel. Shalom, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye bye.
ביי ביי.
תודה רבה לכם.
תודה רבה. Thank you, Sarit.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, guys. But we're all in